After my Silent Hill HD collection review, it's nice to see one HD remaster that adheres to my HD re-release philosophies, them being change as little as possible, that way the games as an art form can be preserved properly for future generations. Now say what you will about video games, but remember, people with foresight will see the artistic potential in an interactive storytelling experience. With that said, here's the Devil May Cry HD collection, the most unartistic HD collection I've ever played, but who cares when I can use an overcompensatory 6-foot sword to launch a demon into the air and keep it afloat with a hail of bullets. Since this collection doesn't make unnecessary changes like in the Silent Hill HD collection, to review this game I'll just go over its individual aspects and see how well they've aged. Wow! Analyzing a game's individual aspects to formulate an opinion, almost like a real critic, except less whoring myself out to the mainstream AAA games industry. DMC1 has aged better in some areas more than others. On one hand, the combat has aged extremely well, and the game has great environments. I also appreciated the game's focus. Everything you do feels like it lends itself to the experience as a whole. That means that there's no arbitrary faffing about that feels totally unimportant to the overarching story. But on the uglier, less presentable hand that's probably used for fapping, the game's story is pretty basic, and it fails to compel me as a result. No, seriously, it tries to do the whole 80s badass action-y hero type setup, only it's not ironic or tongue-in-cheek at all. Well, I guess it kind of is, since on the main title screen the main character says, "Let's rock, baby," totally straight-faced. You could have at least made him roll his eyes, Capcom. But despite all this, I really don't think the bad story's that big a hindrance in DMC1's case. At least because the story's so simple it never gets in the way of gameplay by bombarding us with 6-hour-long expository cutscenes in between every mission. And from that snarky artistic perspective that I brought up a little bit in the beginning of the review, some of the gameplay actually is told through the story, which I think is a very important skill that more AAA modern-day developers need to learn. The aspect of the game that's aged the worst is probably the graphics. They really just don't hold out too well, but this was an early PS2 game, and the graphical flaws don't get in the way of the animations, which are very well done. Despite its age, DMC1 really has aged well and deserves an important spot in the action game genre. DMC2, by contrast, hasn't aged so well, especially not in this enlightened internet age where 12-year-olds can comment about how bad the game is after they make comments regarding how they think they can get a chance with my mom. Ha ha. That's not to say that the stupid 12-year-olds on the internet don't have a point. DMC2 isn't a game that's aged badly so much as it was never really that good to begin with. In DMC circles, fans have never regarded Devil May Cry 2 with anything more than the utmost contempt for tarnishing the name of one of their favorite action genres. Understandably so, since DMC2 was not fun at all to play. The first reason why DMC2 deserves a good buggering is because DMC1's combat, which required hair-trigger reflexes, finesse, and precision, has been replaced by button mashing. Another combat problem is that DMC1's iconic high difficulty has been scaled back to so easy it's monotonous, and the graphics are a mess of murky brown textures in every single level. Say what you will about DMC1's awful 80s action hero shtick thing that it has going on that makes me want to beat all the characters over their heads with a goddamn shovel, at least there's some level of charm in that. All the characters in DMC2 are monotone and bring absolutely nothing to the table. There's no ironic humor, there's no character development, there's absolutely nothing that the characters do that makes me care about them in the slightest. Dante, who used to have some level of personality in the first game as a smart-ass demon hunter, has been reduced to some angsty, tall loner guy who rides a motorcycle who hardly ever talks. Is this supposed to be cool, Capcom? Am I supposed to like this thing over the smarmy cunt from the first game who was at least kind of a joy to listen to when he would destroy a giant demon with his overcompensatory sword, wisecracking all the way, but in Devil May Cry 2 all he does is just kind of stand there angsting? Is that supposed to be better? DMC2 lacks any single variable that's superior to any of the first game's components in any way, shape, or form. What DMC2 does have, though, is it has a few trade-offs, mechanics that aren't necessarily superior to the first game's, but they do have something that the first game didn't, at the cost of something that was in the first game being removed. For one thing, I read the game's environments are 9 times as big as they were in the original. In theory, this would mean heavier exploration and interesting level design, but in practice, the areas are empty and puzzling has basically been thrown out the window altogether. Then there's the ability to play as multiple characters, but they all feel spread thin and the combat is just as bad for all of them. The whole problem with there only being 3 sword combos is present for all 3 of the characters. To conclude my thoughts on DMC2, 10 years ago the game might have been passable, barely passable in the eyes of the most easygoing critic in the history of game reviews, but 10 years later playing it is just a chore, it's monotonous and boring, and I hated all 3 hours of my Dante playthrough. Finally, on to DMC3. Let me just come out and say that if you enjoy action games to even the slightest degree, DMC alone makes this collection worthwhile. Everything that makes DMC1 a classic is back, but improved upon too. And to top it all off, even more gameplay mechanics were added to DMC3, all of which are just as good as all of DMC3's other mechanics, which are all absolutely wonderful. Seriously, as I read this aloud, I'm wondering to myself why I'm doing this instead of playing the game right now. I enjoyed it that much. The graphics, which look great on the PS2, have aged extremely well, especially with the whole HD remaster overhaul thing that the game was advertising so greatly. The combat's been improved because now you can map a function to one of your face buttons. And you can play as another character who, unlike DMC2, actually employs a different fighting style from Dante, so playing as him really mixes up the gameplay. The story is, for the first time in the series, a little engaging, but ultimately still is in the cheesy 80s, 90s action movie territory up until the climactic finish. Admittedly, the game might be a little too difficult, but if you practice enough, you can always devise a strategy that will lead you to victory. It's just that the road to reach that skill level is way arduous. I recommend this collection to anyone who enjoys action games to even the slightest degree, or anyone remotely interested in action games, or anyone who just wants schadenfreude with thoughtless violence.